Tonight, Canadians brace for economic turmoil as the reality of a full-blown trade war with the U.S.
The U.S. national debt has reached a record $37 trillion, according to the latest Treasury Department report that was issued Tuesday.
What if I told you that America, the nation that once dictated the rules of global trade, was suddenly losing its grip on its own backyard? Imagine a world where the United States, crushed under the weight of a staggering $37 trillion debt, finds itself unable to control the very trade routes that fueled its rise. And in this power vacuum, it isn't China, it isn't Europe, but Canada, America's quiet neighbor to the north, that seizes the crown. This isn't some far-off scenario. It's unfolding right now. Cargo that once flooded through U.S. ports is being rerouted through Canadian corridors. Corporations that once relied on Washington's muscle are shifting their bets northward, tying their futures to Ottawa instead. And while the U.S. economy staggers under debt, inflation, and tariffs gone wrong, Canada is quietly rewiring North America's trade map in ways no one thought possible. But here's the real shocker. This reversal didn't take decades. It happened in just a few short months. Washington thought it could bring Ottawa to its knees with 35% tariffs. Instead, that move backfired so hard, it ignited Canada's rise. Now the question is no longer whether Canada can withstand U.S. pressure. It's whether America can survive this new trade order without being pushed to the sidelines. So, how did Canada turn the tables so quickly? And what does this mean for the future of North America? Let's dive in. Because the story is far bigger and far more shocking than you think. The numbers are almost too big to process. $37 trillion. That's the size of America's national debt. A figure so massive it's hard to even imagine. Stack $1 trillion bills on top of each other, and the pile would reach the moon and back. 9 times. Now multiply that by 37. That's the weight sitting on Washington's shoulders. And here's the problem. This isn't just an accounting figure buried in government spreadsheets. It's a shadow that touches every corner of the economy. Every dollar borrowed means higher interest payments. And those payments are now bigger than the entire defense budget. Think about that. America is spending more to service its debt than it does to fund the world's most powerful military. But the danger isn't just the size of the debt, it's the timing. With inflation already eroding paychecks and tariffs pushing prices even higher, the U.S. government has less room than ever to respond. In the past, Washington could spend its way out of crises. Now every attempt to pump money into the system just digs the hole deeper. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. And investors around the world are noticing. The once unshakable U.S. dollar no longer looks invincible. Nations that once lined up to buy American bonds are quietly exploring alternatives, hedging their bets in case the giant finally stumbles. When confidence erodes, power erodes with it. This is the stage America finds itself on today. A giant, still powerful, but weighed down by a chain of debt so heavy it threatens to drag the entire economy underwater. And as Washington wrestles with that burden, something even more destabilizing was about to hit. When Washington rolled out those 35% tariffs, the message was clear. Canada would either play by America's rules or pay the price. The move was meant to be a show of dominance, a hardline strike designed to break Ottawa's resolve and remind everyone who really controlled North American trade. But instead of crippling Canada, those tariffs acted like a boomerang, coming back and hitting the U.S. square in the face. Almost overnight, prices across America began to surge. Industrial components, more expensive. Everyday essentials, more expensive. Even groceries, utilities, and transportation, costs that families couldn't avoid, started climbing higher and higher. And unlike past price spikes that faded with time, these increases became permanent. They weren't temporary surges, they were baked into the economy. For businesses, the choice was brutal. Either absorb the costs and bleed money, or pass them on to customers already struggling to make ends meet. Many chose the latter, and the results were immediate. Households tightened their belts, spending slowed, retailers began cutting back orders, manufacturers reduced output, even service industries, long seen as the safe zone, started freezing hiring or slashing hours. And here's the irony. The policy that was supposed to protect American jobs ended up putting those very jobs at risk. What began as a political maneuver quickly turned into a stranglehold on the U.S. economy. Squeezing from both ends, tariffs raising costs, while inflation eroded purchasing power. Meanwhile, exporters faced another nightmare. Long-standing customers overseas, frustrated by unpredictable U.S. policies, simply turned elsewhere. They didn't wait for Washington to fix its mistakes. They replaced American suppliers with cheaper, more stable alternatives. So instead of forcing Canada to its knees, the tariffs created a new kind of crisis. A self-inflicted wound. And as America struggled to contain the damage, something unexpected was happening north of the border. For decades, Canada lived in America's economic shadow. Its exports flowed south, its corporations relied on U.S. markets and its ports, and infrastructure were built around serving the needs of its giant neighbor. Washington assumed that if a trade war ever broke out, Ottawa would fold quickly. It simply had too much to lose. But that assumption turned out to be Washington's biggest mistake. Instead of buckling, Canada turned the pressure into fuel. The 35% tariff wall, meant to isolate Ottawa, became the very spark that forced it to rewire its economy. Cargo that once poured into U.S. ports was redirected north. Canadian rail networks, highways, and ports were suddenly flooded with new investment, transforming them into the backbone of an independent supply chain. And here's the twist. Businesses that once depended on American routes started finding Canada more efficient. Shipping delays and political uncertainty south of the border pushed companies to reroute through Vancouver, Montreal, and Halifax. Suddenly, Ottawa wasn't just surviving the tariffs. It was winning new business because of them. This shift wasn't only about logistics, it was about leverage. For the first time in modern history, U.S. corporations found themselves on the back foot, forced to adapt to Canadian terms. From energy companies to tech manufacturers, more and more firms had no choice but to rely on Canadian infrastructure, Canadian supply chains, and Canadian markets. What began as a defensive scramble soon evolved into a bold strategy. Canada wasn't just protecting itself anymore. It was redrawing the map of North American trade. And while Washington was still reeling from its own economic missteps, Ottawa was already preparing its next move. Because Canada knew one thing: to lock in its newfound power, it needed allies. And that's when Ottawa turned to Mexico. While Washington was trapped in its own policy misfires, Ottawa was quietly building something far more ambitious. A brand new trade corridor that cut America out of the equation. And at the center of it all was Mexico. Instead of waiting for U.S. politics to settle down, Canada moved fast. High-level visits from its foreign and finance ministers weren't just symbolic photo ops. They were strategy sessions that forged a Canada-Mexico economic shield. This wasn't about handshakes. It was about reshaping the foundation of North American trade. Billions of dollars began flowing south through an unlikely source, the Maple 8, a coalition of Canadian pension funds controlling over $2 trillion in assets. These funds weren't buying stock portfolios or suburban office parks. They were sinking money into Mexico's future, new port expansions, renewable energy grids, and massive cross-border logistics systems. Why? Because these projects created alternative supply routes that made the U.S. optional. For the first time in generations, North American commerce could move between Canada and Mexico without relying on U.S. infrastructure. This alliance didn't just diversify trade, it rewired it. Canada and Mexico suddenly had the ability to move goods, capital, and energy freely between them, while insulating their economies from Washington's unpredictable tariffs and political brinksmanship. In other words, Ottawa and Mexico City weren't just partners, they were becoming the architects of a new North American backbone. And it was working. While U.S. companies scrambled to cope with bottlenecks and rising costs, Canadian and Mexican supply chains grew stronger, leaner, and more efficient. Ottawa wasn't just surviving the trade war. It was building an entirely new system that threatened to leave Washington behind. But Canada had an even bigger card to play. One it didn't need to negotiate, legislate, or vote on. A quiet weapon that America couldn't ignore: energy. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you brandish. It's the one your opponent can't live without. For Canada, that weapon is energy. The United States may be a global superpower, but when it comes to crude oil, it's heavily locked into Canadian supply. Washington can talk tough on tariffs. It can rattle the trade war drums. But the pipelines tell a different story. U.S. refineries are literally built around Canadian crude. Reconfiguring them would take years and cost billions. Which means one thing: if Canada stopped shipping, America's fuel prices would skyrocket overnight. This dependence runs deeper than most Americans realize. It's not just about filling gas tanks, it's about keeping industries alive. Trucking, aviation, plastics, agriculture. Entire sectors of the U.S. economy are tied to the steady flow of Canadian energy. Any disruption would ripple straight through households and boardrooms alike, pushing costs to unbearable levels and sparking public outrage. And here's where Ottawa plays its hand brilliantly. Canada doesn't need to threaten or even raise its voice. Simply by continuing to pump and sell at market prices, it maintains quiet control. Every barrel shipped south is both a lifeline and a reminder Washington can't push too far without hurting itself. Meanwhile, Canada is reinvesting those energy revenues back into its future. Exploration, new pipelines, and even renewable projects are strengthening its position. The more the U.S. depends on Canadian oil, the more Ottawa uses the profits to expand its dominance, not just in fossil fuels, but in the energy grids of tomorrow. This creates a rare kind of stalemate. On the surface, Washington talks tough, but behind closed doors, policymakers know the truth. One wrong move against Canadian energy, and the backlash would slam into America's own economy like a hammer. So while tariffs and debt weigh the U.S. down, Canada's energy leverage acts as a shield, one that quietly shapes the rules of engagement. But as energy secured Ottawa's strength, another shockwave was brewing, one that would change the corporate world across the entire continent. When tariffs hit and uncertainty spread, American companies faced a brutal choice: stay loyal to Washington and bleed profits, or shift operations to safer ground. For many, the answer came quickly: pack up and move north. At first, it was contingency planning. A few production lines shifted, some warehouses relocated, supply chains quietly adjusted. But within a year, it snowballed into a corporate migration. U.S. firms weren't just hedging anymore. They were rebuilding inside Canada. Why Canada? Simple. By operating under Ottawa's umbrella, they escaped the crushing tariffs that Washington had imposed. From Canada, they could still tap into global markets without being punished by unpredictable U.S. trade policy. Tech giants, auto manufacturers, and even pharmaceutical companies began moving. Critical research, assembly, and distribution hubs north of the border. The result? Canada's export portfolio transformed almost overnight. The share of goods flowing south into the U.S., which once stood at a towering 78%, plunged to 68% in just 1 year. That's one of the steepest trade diversifications in modern Canadian history. For Ottawa, it was proof that its strategy was working. For Washington, it was a wake-up call that came too late. And it wasn't just about exports. Ports in Vancouver, Halifax, and Montreal expanded to capture new traffic. Canadian rail networks began carrying high-value freight that once relied on U.S. corridors. Inland hubs in Alberta and Ontario turned into logistical choke points, bypassing American territory entirely. In other words, the very geography of North American trade was being redrawn. What had been Washington's greatest advantage, its infrastructure dominance, was slipping away piece by piece. And the cost to the U.S. wasn't measured only in lost revenue. It was about lost control. The ability to dictate where, when, and how goods moved across the continent had been the foundation of America's regional dominance for decades. Now that foundation was cracking. As more corporations shifted north and global supply chains reoriented around Canada, one question began to echo in Washington's halls of power. Had the United States just handed over its trade crown without a fight? Because if the trend continued, America wouldn't just lose market share, it would lose the leverage that once made it untouchable. And that led to the final, most unsettling realization: Washington was no longer setting the rules. It was being forced to play by someone else's. For more than a century, Washington held the power to dictate the rules of trade in North America. The U.S. decided the terms, set the pace, and everyone else, Canada, Mexico, even global players, had to adapt. But today, that grip is slipping, and the consequences are staggering. The $37 trillion debt is one anchor. The failed tariff war is another. Layer on inflation, rising energy costs, and corporate migration northward, and what you get is a United States no longer shaping the trade order, but reacting to it. Here's the shift in plain sight. American corporations are no longer looking to Washington for stability. Instead, they're depending on Canadian ports, Canadian supply chains, and Canadian trade agreements to keep their businesses alive. Every new investment in Ottawa's logistics hubs, every factory relocated across the border, chips away at Washington's leverage. And that leverage was never just about money, it was about control. The power to decide how goods moved, who got access, and at what cost. But with more trade routes bypassing U.S. soil entirely, that control is dissolving. In its place, Canada is stepping into the role Washington once took for granted, the gatekeeper of North America's trade. The strategic cost is enormous. By losing its influence over trade flows, America is also losing bargaining power on the global stage. Allies and rivals alike see the shift. They're watching as Canada cements its role as a stable hub, while Washington drowns in internal battles and policy missteps. And here's the real danger. The longer this imbalance lasts, the harder it becomes to reverse. Every year that Ottawa strengthens its supply lines, deepens ties with Mexico, and expands its energy dominance, the more entrenched its leadership becomes. Washington can no longer just snap its fingers and take back control. That leaves America facing a stark question: is this just a temporary stumble, or the beginning of a permanent decline? If Canada continues to rise unchecked, the U.S. may soon find itself not as the leader of North America, but as a follower forced to play by someone else's rules. And that brings us to the most unsettling part of this entire story. So here we are, standing at the edge of a new reality. In the span of just months, the United States went from hammering Canada with 35% tariffs to watching its northern neighbor seize the very crown Washington thought it could never lose. The numbers don't lie. A $37 trillion debt, a crippling wave of inflation, corporations fleeing north, and a trade map that now runs through Ottawa instead of Washington. Canada, once dismissed as the quiet partner, has flipped the script. It turned tariffs into leverage, debt into opportunity, and alliances with Mexico into a new backbone of North American trade. It has energy as its silent weapon, infrastructure as its shield, and global corporations as its unlikely allies. Piece by piece, Ottawa has rewired the continent, and Washington is no longer the one pulling the strings. But here's the chilling part. This reversal happened faster than anyone thought possible. If the United States can lose its trade dominance in just a few short months, what else can it lose? Influence? Credibility? Global leadership itself? This isn't just about economics. It's about power. It's about who sets the rules in a world that's shifting beneath our feet. And if America continues down this path, it may find itself not leading but following, a player in a game it once controlled. So the question isn't whether Canada is rising. That much is clear. The real question is, will America fight to reclaim its place, or will it allow a new trade order to solidify without it? Because history shows one thing: once a crown is lost, getting it back is far harder than anyone expects.